On the morning of September 26, 2003, 32-year-old Army veteran Eric Nelams was shot and killed outside his home in Phenix City, Alabama. He had been ambushed in his carport as he was leaving for work. Nothing was stolen, and a witness reported seeing more than one suspect flee the scene. Eric's family was devastated by his murder, but they weren't at a loss for who might be behind it. From the very beginning, they had their suspicions. In fact, they could think of at least 2 people who had motive to see Eric silenced. But more than 20 years later, no one has ever been arrested, and the people who love Eric the most are still waiting for answers. Hey everyone, welcome back to Detective Perspective. My name is Derrick Levasseur. I'm a licensed private investigator and former police detective. Each week I'll be covering an unsolved case in story format. I'll then give you my perspective on the investigation and provide contact information for the individuals or organizations connected to the case so that if you have any tips, you can contact them directly and maybe you can help solve a case. So if you're someone who's interested in true crime, specifically unsolved cases, and you would like to hear my opinion on those investigations, please consider subscribing whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. So tonight's case is going to be an interesting one. On the surface, to me, it appears to be a murder for hire. The question is, who ordered the hit? And we're going to talk about a couple persons of interest, but to be fair, at this point, no one has been arrested. And so you have to ask the question, why? Is it because there's not enough evidence, or is it because we're looking at the wrong people? And to make sure that we have all the facts right in this case, we had the privilege of working with Eric's family on this story. So I want to send a personal thank you out to Eric's mother, Annie, his sister, Kathy, his nephew, Vincent, his niece, Takia, who, by the way, they all talked to us for over 2 hours to make sure we could create the research and the story behind this so that as you guys leave this episode, you have all the accurate information. So we have a lot to cover. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's dive into this week's case. Eric Bernard Nelams was born on June 10th, 1971. He was the youngest child of his mother, Annie, who described him as happy and playful. He loved cookouts, family gatherings, and spending time with other kids. She also said that he was very smart and respectful, even from a young age. Eric grew up in Columbus, Georgia, alongside his older sister, Kathy. In media reports, it's often said that Eric had 15 siblings, which is true, but those siblings came through marriage and entered his life at different times. Eric and Kathy considered each other their only true siblings because they were raised together, and they weren't just close, they were best friends. Kathy said they were each other's core people, and she remembers Eric as being happy-go-lucky with energy people gravitated toward. He had a way of making those around him feel loved. As a teenager, Eric attended Carver High School in Columbus and graduated in 1989. After that, he enrolled at DeVry University in Atlanta, where he studied computers and electronics, subjects he had an interest in since he was a kid. But tuition was expensive and the family had to make some difficult financial decisions. Eventually, they could no longer afford the cost, and Eric left school. Wanting to build a future for himself, Eric joined the Army. He was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, Fort Campbell in Kentucky, and then in Germany. He also served overseas during the Persian Gulf War. Later, he trained at Fort Benning in Georgia and became part of the elite airborne school. While he was stationed there, he was able to see Kathy often since the base bordered their hometown of Columbus. At the time, Kathy was a single mom with 2 young children. She worked overnight shifts in the emergency room and was often exhausted during the day. So Eric would stop by to help feeding the kids, changing diapers, and stepping in wherever he was needed. He did it all without ever being asked. That's the type of person that Eric was. Kathy told us, quote, "That speaks to his character because I didn't have to ask. He just did it automatically." Her children, Takia and Vincent, were especially close to Eric, and they saw him as a father figure, someone they could count on. In 1994, Eric got married to his first wife, and together they had a son, Antonio. After he and his wife divorced in 1999, Antonio stayed with his mother. but Eric remained involved in his life and saw him often. Eventually, Eric left the military and he remarried. He and his new wife Molly moved to Phenix City, Alabama, just across the state line from Columbus with her 2 children. They settled into a home in the middle of a quiet cul-de-sac in the Carpenter's Way division at 2300 Level Court. During this entire time, Eric stayed close with his son, mom, sister, and niece and nephew. His family looked up to him and they leaned on him. He was their rock. But in September of 2003, when Eric was just 32 years old, all of that was stolen from them. In the early morning hours of September 26, 2003, Eric got ready for work at his home on Level Court. Just before 5:30 a.m., he left the house and headed toward his truck, which was parked under the carport. But before he could make it to the driver's seat, he was ambushed and shot multiple times. He died there in the carport, just steps from his door. Eric's wife Molly heard the gunshots and called 911. Police arrived a short time later and found Eric lying in the driveway. He had been killed by multiple gunshot wounds. His murder came as a complete shock to his family. Annie later told Citizen of East Alabama, quote, "At first I didn't believe it, but as I made my way to the house, I felt something was wrong. There was a deep hurt in my heart." When she arrived, she saw her son lying there in the driveway. She said, quote, "He was my baby, my only son. It hurt me, it hurt his sister, and it hurt his son." Detectives began investigating right away. They examined Eric's body and his truck and found that none of his belongings had been taken, something that seemed to rule out the possibility as robbery being the motive. Several pieces of evidence were collected at the scene, including bullet casings and latent fingerprints from the truck, but as far as the family knows, that evidence unfortunately did not lead anywhere. Detectives also looked for eyewitnesses who may help in the case, and they ended up locating one person who had actually seen the shooting. We're going to talk about what they saw right after this break. So by now, you guys know I'm an animal lover, and unfortunately, I do not currently have a cat, but I've always loved them. I grew up with them my entire life. Unfortunately, with the dog, it does make it difficult to have a cat now, but my loss is someone else's gain. So in this case, it's my assistant, Ashley. So I got my Smalls order in the other day and I brought it here to the office and it was packed. It was a big box with a new serving bowl, a little Tupperware serving container with a scoop. It had hard food, soft food, toys, treats, you name it. Ashley was pumped. So she took it home to her cats, tried it out. They absolutely loved it. The only thing now, she says, hey, I have to switch over because once I give it to them, I can't take it away. So she's sitting pretty now. The cats are thanking Smalls for the upgrade. So if your cat is having digestive issues, throwing up their food, or simply in need of a diet upgrade, Smalls is the cat food for you. Smalls cat food is protein-packed recipes made with preservative-free ingredients you'll find right in your fridge, and it's delivered right to your door. That's why Cats.com named Smalls their best overall cat food. To get 35% off plus an additional 50% off your first order, head to Smalls.com and use my promo code DETECTIVE for a limited time only. In addition to the food being great, Smalls also works with the Humane Society, and they've donated over $1 million worth of food to help cats through the Humane Society process, and they also give you a chance to donate at checkout, so whether you donate $5 for flea and tick medications or $7 for vaccinations, they've got different options for you so you can not only get great food, but also contribute to a great cause. As far as Ashley's concerned, it's only been a little over a week, but she swears she's already seeing shinier, softer coats, and the litter boxes are a lot less stinky, so I think we can all get on board with that. So what are you waiting for? Give your cat the food they deserve. For a limited time only, because you're a Detective Perspective listener or viewer, you can get 35% off plus an additional 50% off your first order just by using my code DETECTIVE. That's an additional 50% off when you head to Smalls.com and use promo code DETECTIVE. Again, that's promo code DETECTIVE for an additional 50% off your first order. And if that's not enough, you'll also get free shipping only at Smalls.com. Okay, we're back. So let's talk about this witness because according to police, she reported seeing 2 men. And I emphasize men because that will become important later in the story, especially in my perspective. So she remembered their body types, the clothes they were wearing, and their overall appearances, but she couldn't recall any facial features, which is understandable depending on the angle and how far away she was. You may think that we all have these magnifying glasses on our face, but the further away you are, the harder it is to make out those features. But I would think, even as I sit here right now, she would at least be able to tell you the color of their skin, maybe the style of their hair, maybe not mustaches, goatees, things like that, but just an overall understanding of what we are looking for, who we are looking for. She also said she saw the suspects run to a nearby black car before fleeing the scene. So I'm sure some of you are sitting here wondering, asking the question, are we to believe this is everything that she reported? If this had just happened, I would say probably not. Law enforcement may be holding back specific information in order to conduct their investigation, distinguishing marks about the vehicle or the suspects. However, this was 20 plus years ago. So if there was something that could reinvigorate the case, maybe a more specific description of the vehicle or one of the suspects, I would believe at this point that they would come out and share that information after not getting the leads they were hoping for. So as I sit here right now, if you made me choose, I would say what we have is what we have. And the witness was probably very cautious about what they said, which I like. I always tell our witnesses when they come in, don't tell me what you think, tell me what you know. And that may be the case here where the witness didn't want to divulge anything they weren't certain about. And unfortunately, this may be all we have as far as the details about the vehicle and the suspects. Now, the way I'm saying that, you would think it's a bad thing, but I would put this out there. This is actually case 89 that we've covered here on this channel. So yes, I would like it to lead somewhere, but as you guys know, in other cases that we covered, we don't even have this usually. So it's a step in the right direction, especially if we're able to identify individuals that might be involved with the crime. Speaking of that, with all of this information that law enforcement had gathered so far, detectives tried to figure out why someone would ambush Eric outside his home just after leaving for work. By this point, Eric's family already had a theory, and they believed it involved a married couple named Stephanie and Eric Cowling. And to avoid confusion going forward in this episode, I'll refer to Eric Cowling simply as Stephanie's husband. I'm going to call Eric by his name. This guy, I don't really care as much. So congratulations, you're now Stephanie's husband. So let's talk about Stephanie and Stephanie's husband, because right before Eric Nelams was killed, his family found out that the Cowlings had looped Eric into an embezzlement scheme involving two separate businesses. According to court records, Stephanie Cowling worked as a line haul manager at Excel Direct Incorporated, which was a trucking company, from around July 2000 through May 2002. She was fired in late 2002 for, quote, performance-related problems. Not long after, in December of 2002, she was hired by another trucking company, DHL, as a domestic manager. She continued working there until September of 2003, just days before Eric was murdered. Now, during Stephanie's time at Excel, she and her husband came up with a plan to defraud the company. Their scheme involved creating a fake vendor, someone who had no connection to the trucking industry, and then submitting fake freight bills so the companies would unknowingly send payments to that vendor. Once the checks were issued, the fake vendor would withdraw the cash, which was then split up. The majority went to Stephanie and her husband, while a smaller portion was given to the third-party vendor. That third-party vendor happened to be Eric Nelams. Eric's family told us that it was Stephanie's husband who approached Eric and asked him to get involved. And eventually, Eric agreed. His loved ones didn't understand why he would take part in something like this, but they believed it came down to one thing: providing for his family. The Cowlings were living comfortably, and Eric wanted to have the same kind of stability. He and his family were driving used cars, struggling with bills, and dealing with debt. Even with his steady job, it just wasn't enough. And I want to talk about this for a minute because there is sometimes a stigma around this where immediately when the listeners or viewers hear that the victim was involved in a crime before their unfortunate incident, in this case a murder, they tune out. They don't want to be involved anymore, and they're like, hey, you know what? It's karma, street justice. I don't feel bad for them. But let me tell you, I worked in investigations on the street for 13 years. And I've been in investigations in totality, both in the public and private sector, for almost 20 years. And I can tell you, when I was undercover, I arrested a lot of people, and there were some bad people that I got involved with. But I will tell you this, there was also a lot of good people. And I had this phrase, and I wasn't the first one to come up with it. I don't even know where I got it from. But It's that good people sometimes make bad decisions. And more times than not, what I found, even when I got involved with people who were selling a lot of drugs, in many instances, it was for the quote unquote right reason. Now, do I condone what they were doing? Absolutely not. But in many instances, they were providing for their family. Now, I would argue, and I said this directly to their faces, it may not be as lucrative, it may not be as easy, but there are other ways to make money. Yes, it's harder and it takes more effort, but it's the right way to go about things. And I would try to get them on the right track. So I say all this to say to you, don't judge Eric because of some of the mistakes he made. Yes, these are not victimless crimes. They are business owners. They're losing out on a lot of money, and we're going to talk more about it. But at the end of the day, I do think Eric's heart was in the right place. And although I wish he made better decisions, it shouldn't have cost his life. And not to bury the lead here, but I do believe that some of these decisions may have been the reason why he was killed. So stick with me because we're here for the right reason. The people responsible for his death need to be held accountable, and that's what matters. So talking about this with Eric's family, Kathy told us that he must not have had much money coming in from this scheme, because if he had access to large amounts of cash, he would have helped out her and their mother. He wouldn't have ignored how much they were struggling, and trust me, they were. But back to this scheme, because it was elaborate and it was ongoing. According to court documents, Stephanie continued running the fraudulent scheme when she went back to work at DHL, and they were actually the first to uncover everything that was going on. On September 21st, 2003, just 5 days before Eric was murdered, Stephanie was asked about a vendor named Eric Nelams, and she was also questioned about invoices connected to him. She said she knew who the vendor was, but she would need to gather and review some of the paperwork before discussing it further. After that conversation, Stephanie obviously knew she had been caught, so she left work and she never came back. Her supervisor later searched her office and couldn't find a single document to suggest that Eric Nelams had ever been a legitimate vendor. Later, after Eric was killed, DHL reached out to Excel, Stephanie's former employer, and told them about what they had discovered. Excel then launched their own audit and realized that Stephanie had embezzled from them as well. Altogether, her schemes had defrauded both companies of more than $453,000. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $800,000 today. Both companies turned their findings over to law enforcement, and the investigation was opened. But at the time of Eric's murder, that investigation either hadn't started or wasn't in full force yet. The only people who truly understood the scope of the fraud at that point would have been the people inside DHL and maybe Excel. Okay, so I think we've covered the fraud. Let's go back to September 21st, the day Stephanie found out that she had been caught. Like I just mentioned, she left work and never returned. 2 days later, on September 23rd, Stephanie and her husband met with Eric and his wife. According to court records, the purpose of this meeting was to get, quote, on the same page before being questioned by DHL security, which Stephanie figured would happen soon. During the meeting, Stephanie handed Eric 2 documents which she wanted him to use when speaking with DHL. The first was a $2,900 freight bill in Eric's name signed by Stephanie. The second was a handwritten document that included freight and billing language, explanations, and a list of internal DHL contacts, essentially a cheat sheet so that Eric would have an understanding and a little bit of a knowledge about the trucking industry. Now, both documents were later found inside Eric's home after he was murdered. Court records state that during that same meeting, Stephanie also urged Eric to take the blame for the entire scheme, but he refused. After the meeting, Eric confided in Kathy and told her about what was going on. And then, just 3 days later, he was killed. So listen, I'm not making jumps here. As we sit here right now, as far as I know, Stephanie and her husband are not suspects. They're not even persons of interest. There has been some mention that this scheme may be connected to his death, but there has never been anything overt that is where the law enforcement has come out right and said that Stephanie and Stephanie's husband are people of interest in this case, as far as I know. So this is a lot of speculation at this point, but I would be a fool not to tell you about this information, regardless of where it came from. Again, these are all in court documents. But when we're thinking about who would have a reason, a motive to kill Eric at his house at 5:30 in the morning, that list is going to be relatively short. This is a big risk to go out and murder someone. And you have to think about what type of stakes would be at play in order for someone to do something like this. And I think it's fair to say that when you're talking about having your freedom revoked, and I'm talking about Stephanie and her husband, for them, this could have been enough. So I simply tell you what I've learned and what Eric was involved in and who were the players in that game, because if we're going to cover this case with accuracy, we have to talk about it. But as far as conclusions to be made from here, I'm going to allow you to take that information and do whatever you want with it. For me, I think it's valuable. And if I had to guess, it was very valuable to law enforcement. Now, as far as Stephanie and her husband are concerned, it would take more than 2.5 years before they were officially indicted. In May of 2006, a federal grand jury returned a 60-count indictment charging the couple with conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, along with dozens of individual counts of fraud and transporting stolen checks across state lines. Eventually, both pleaded guilty to a conspiracy charge as part of a plea deal. Stephanie was sentenced to 42 months in prison, while her husband received 36 months after the court determined he had played a lesser role. From the moment Eric Nelams was killed, his family believed that this fraud scheme was connected to his murder. But according to them, the police didn't share that same belief. According to Eric's family, even after the Cowlings were federally indicted, Phenix City police never conducted a full investigation into their potential involvement. And I preface that by saying, according to them, because law enforcement hasn't been too vocal about it, so we don't know what they actually did or what they didn't do. But I think at minimum, we can all agree that if they didn't fully investigate the possible connection, that decision may have led to some missed opportunities. And listen, this isn't all speculation, because when investigators searched the Cowlings' home in connection with the fraud case, they did find a gun, but it was never tested for fingerprints or ballistics. Why? Because the investigators were focused solely on the white-collar crimes that Stephanie and her husband were involved in. They never considered the possibility that this weapon could be connected to other crimes and potentially Eric's murder. Eric's family believes this was a major oversight, and I completely agree, but at the same time, they acknowledge that jurisdictional issues may have played a role. The Cowlings were being investigated by a different agency than the Phenix City Police, and if those agencies weren't in contact, then investigators searching the Cowlings' home may not have known to test the weapon. And I understand where they're coming from here, and I appreciate the fact that Eric's family is as willing to give them the benefit of the doubt as they are, but I would push back on that. I think even after the fact, there can be some communication, and it's a phone call or an email away. Yes, it was 20 years ago, but communication was still pretty good. Would it be an internal database that would be connected? No, but you have to think that if a detective is doing his job and he's looking into people who have a potential motive, this is something that would eventually come on their radar. And even if it wasn't before the search was conducted, the gun was seized, I would think. I don't have any information to say that it was given back to them, especially considering they're felons. So if you have the gun in custody and detectives, while they're doing their own investigation, realize that some of the people on their list have now been connected to another crime that their victim was also involved in, you would go back to those investigators and say, hey, what did you get from that search? It may be connected, it may not be. Just let us take a look at it. You look at it, you see what was taken into inventory, you see that there was a gun, and then obviously at that point you would say, oh, don't turn that gun back over to him. There's some testing we need to do. But apparently, again, without having access to the actual documents or what was done or what was not done, we don't know if that was ever the case. And if it wasn't, that's a huge blow to this investigation. But even with Eric's family giving law enforcement a little bit of leeway here, they can't help but wonder, if Phenix City Police had looked into the Cowlings early on, like the family had asked them to, would they also be paying closer attention to this fraud case, and then maybe they might have found the gun? And who can argue with that? Of course that's the case. And listen, it doesn't take a family member who's connected to the case or a cop who's looking at it now 20 years later. This is basic investigations. You're looking at your victim, you're building out a tree, you're looking at who would have a motive to kill your victim, and if you find out that your victim was involved in some type of scheme with some nefarious individuals and things were coming to a head and your victim refused to cooperate with them and take the fall, That's somebody you'd be looking at. That's Detective 101. Fast forward to 2009, Stephanie and her husband were released from federal prison, and since then they appear to have stayed out of trouble, which would make sense because now they know they're on everybody's radar. And they've never publicly been connected to Eric's murder by the police. In fact, the only reason their names are widely known is because of the fraud case. Court documents mention Eric Nelams by name and note that he was murdered not long after meeting with the couple to, quote, get on the same page. It's right there in black and white. But that detail alone wasn't enough to bring charges, and in the end, no one was arrested and Eric's case went cold. Over the years, Eric's family has carried the investigation forward, and based on what they've learned, they still believe the Cowlings were involved. There have also been long-standing rumors in both Columbus and Phenix City suggesting that Eric's wife Molly may have also played a role as well. Before his death, Eric told Kathy and Annie that his marriage was falling apart. He said he wanted a divorce and asked Molly to move out. After she left, he changed the locks, but about a week before the shooting, they reconciled and she moved back in. The family theorizes that Molly may have feared being indicted in the fraud case as well. They say that she knew about the embezzlement and had been present at the meeting where the Cowlings tried to get Eric to take the blame for everything. They believe that could have been enough motive, whether to commit murder or to help facilitate it, they don't know. What they do know for sure is that whoever killed Eric knew his schedule. They knew what time he left for work, and Molly would have had access to that information. Still, the family has always hoped she wasn't involved. And just like with the Cowlings, she has never been named a suspect in Eric's murder. These are simply things the family has heard and wrestled with over the years. In July of 2024, Phenix City police gave a significant update on Eric's case. They told the citizen of East Alabama that the case remains open and active, and the last known investigative activity occurred a few months earlier in March of 2024. At that time, they publicly confirmed that they've considered the fraud case as a possible motive in Eric's murder. They also stated that there is, quote, reasonable suspicion of a murder for hire. And I completely agree with this, and I'm going to talk about it more in the perspective, but just on the surface here. If you believe that Molly, Stephanie, and Stephanie's husband, or some combination of that, maybe Molly's out of it, maybe it's just Stephanie and Stephanie's husband, whatever you're to believe, you have one male and one female, or one male and two females. From what we've gathered from the witness, if they're accurate, there were two males at the crime scene that fled the area in a black car. And that means someone that we have not identified yet has been brought into this equation. And if I was really to go out on a limb here and make an educated guess, I would say that if we ever found out the identities of these two male individuals who were at the crime scene who committed the murder, more than likely based on historical data and experience and past cases that are similar to this, more than likely, neither one of these male individuals is going to turn out to be Stephanie's husband, which means they hired someone to carry out the job. Now, there's also a possibility that Eric was involved in some other things, and these two males that carried out this murder were directly connected to it. But if you want to separate yourself and you want to make sure that it doesn't get tied back to you, the best case scenario is to hire someone who has no connection to the victim. So I do think it's a very probable scenario that this was in fact a murder for hire. And again, we're going to talk about that more and where we go from here with that theory. Now, in addition to the Phenix City Police Department, Annie also spoke to the citizen of East Alabama saying, quote, 2 decades later, we have not even started to get over this. It's every day I live with this hurt. She added, quote, a lot of people know what happened. The Phenix City Police Department has got to prove what I already know. I pray for his killers to come forward. My son didn't deserve that. Unfortunately, there have been no other major updates in Eric's case. His murder remains unsolved, and his family is still desperate to know who killed him. They've made it clear that they won't stop pushing for justice. Annie says she hopes that whoever was responsible will spend the rest of their life in prison so they can never escape what they did. Kathy said that for a long time, they lived in fear. They worried that the people responsible might retaliate for speaking out or pressuring the police to take action. They didn't know who they could trust, and for years, they were always looking over their shoulders. Now Kathy says that she hopes the people who killed Eric have lived with the same fear. Vincent, Kathy's son, hopes the killers have spent the last 2 decades feeling anxious and nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders too. Today, Eric's family continues to fight for answers. They've worked hard to keep his name in the public eye. They've launched a change.org petition asking the Alabama Attorney General to investigate Eric's case. In the past few months, they've also secured a $5,000 grant from the Higher Hope Foundation to add to the reward fund, bringing the total to $15,000. Now, this Higher Hope Foundation may sound familiar to you. It's connected to our friends Kendall, Ray, and Josh. They started this foundation probably a little over a year ago. I promoted it on my social media. Great cause. They're giving back to the families that need it, and I'm completely behind it. In addition to the reward fund, Eric's family has also worked to obtain multiple donated billboards, which brought renewed media coverage and public attention, and those efforts led to new articles and renewed hope. And the family says they're not slowing down. There are more awareness efforts on the way, and they will continue doing whatever they can to make sure that Eric is not forgotten. Kathy hopes people remember the kind of man Eric really was. She wants people to focus on the goodness in him and how deeply he's still missed. Eric looked after his family and served this country. He inspired his son and stepdaughter so much that they both joined the army, following in his footsteps. Kathy wants people to remember that Eric was a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a veteran. And above all else, he was a human being. He didn't deserve to be ambushed and gunned down outside his home. And now it's on us to find the people responsible. All right, let's dive into this perspective. I'm going to keep it clear and concise, right to the point. I'm going to elaborate on some of the things I said in the episode, but I want to focus on where we go from here. What can be done if it hasn't already been done? I want to start by saying this case reminds me of a case that I covered on Crime Weekly, Dan Markel. Some of you may be familiar with it. Very similar. He was gunned down in his driveway by 2 men who were hired to kill him. Very similar circumstances, and I think that's potentially what we're looking at here. And just like in that case, what ultimately solved it was not only looking into what happened on the day of Dan's murder, but looking into the days leading up to it. So in that particular case, what happened was the vehicle that was seen at the shooting, it was also seen at Dan Markel's gym days earlier. They had been scouting him. They had been learning his schedule so they could find the best opportunity to get the jump on him. And that could have happened here. So the first recommendation is to look at any surveillance footage from the day in question, the day of the murder, but to also go back and look at any other surveillance that was seized at the time, which may show Eric's whereabouts leading up to his murder. Was there any vehicle, specifically a black vehicle, that had been following him for a couple days? Did he make any mention of any vehicles that were suspicious to him? Because if that's the case, there may have been someone following his whereabouts, learning his schedule to understand when he left for work in the morning. That would potentially remove Molly from the equation. Because again, we want to look for information that implicates people, but we also want to find the information that exonerates people as well. It's about getting it right. It's not a particular person we're looking to target. We just want to find out who did it. So you're looking for both. And this is important to go back, see what you have a new fresh set of eyes, look at any surveillance footage you have, and maybe they spot something in there that stands out to them and starts to get this case going again. That's number one. The second thing would be the gun that was seized from Stephanie and her husband's home. I don't know if it's still in custody. It's been 20 years, so it may not be. I know after a period of time, especially after the case is adjudicated, the firearm is either returned or it's destroyed. It's incinerated in many cases. I hope that's not the case. I'm praying it isn't, but I would be lying to you guys if I said it's not a strong possibility. But let's just hope for a second it's still in custody for whatever reason. There's still an opportunity to take that, test fire it, compare the shell casings to Eric's crime scene and see if there's a match. They would use the striations on the bullet casings to see if it matches the bullet casings at the crime scene. And if it does, boom, you have a match. Now you bring Stephanie and her husband back in. You can also just do a preliminary investigation. We know the caliber of weapon in Eric's case if we have the shell casings. What caliber was the weapon found at Stephanie and her husband's home? Even if we don't have it anymore, if the gun is the same caliber, it's not everything. It's not a quote unquote smoking gun, but it's a start. To have these two individuals who are connected to our victim, who clearly had some issues with him and were in a position where if Eric was no longer around, it would probably benefit them because then they would be the only story in town. To find a gun in their house that potentially matches the caliber of the weapon used in his murder, that would be something. It would be something to add to the narrative if you're going to potentially ever charge them. Now, if we go back to what I was talking about earlier in the episode about a murder for hire, if they're smart, they have no connection to Eric's case. And if they hired someone, then that would mean that the gun inside their house has nothing to do with how Eric was killed. It just so happens that they have a gun, maybe for personal connection. You know, they are embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe a reason why they need to carry a gun, but that's a different story for a different day. So yes, if the gun is still around, we need to look into it. We need to see if there are any similarities. We need to see if it could be connected to Eric's case. That's definitely something that has to be done, and I hope it's already been done 20 years ago. But without them divulging that information publicly, we just don't know at this point, but I wanted to bring it up. Next thing we want to do is bring in everyone connected to Eric. There's no harm in re-interviewing people, especially if they're willing to do it. Family members, friends, colleagues, associates, potential persons of interest, anybody who's willing to speak, especially anybody who knew his schedule. Molly would come in as well. We want to talk to everyone. We want to see if they still give the same statements that they gave 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we also want to look into their current history. There's a lot of time that's passed. What type of things have they been involved in since Eric's murder? Have they been in prison for anything else? Have they committed crimes? Was there anything in their, current recent history that would suggest they have a propensity for violence? These are things that we want to look into because what do I always say to you guys, part-time detectives out there? Best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. In this case, the new behavior that we're discovering could be an indicator to what they did in the past. So a little bit of a reversal, but the same application. And speaking of looking into people, we also have to look into Eric. We know he was involved in this embezzlement scheme. We have to ensure he wasn't involved in anything else. Was he involved in any other people who could have had malicious intentions, who may have wanted to hurt him? I'm not saying Eric was a bad guy, but if he was hurting for money and he was involved in one scheme or one crime, could he have been involved in something else that the family didn't know about? Now, I'm hoping that's not the case, but I think even Eric's family would agree. If learning about Eric and his other dealings led to the killers, they would be completely on board. So we have to check that box. We have to ensure that the only things that Eric had going on at the time of his murder was this fraud scheme. If there's something else, then that's another path that we have to travel. And to wrap up our list of people who need to be spoken to, Stephanie and her husband would also be on that list, although I don't know if they'd be willing to speak with law enforcement. However, if they're playing by the rules and they had nothing to do with the crime, bring a lawyer with you. Go speak to law enforcement. I'm assuming they had already been spoken to, but let's see if they give the same story since the last time they gave their alibis for the day in question. At minimum, you bring them in, you let them know that you're still thinking about them, and they're still on the radar. And if you get really lucky, they completely contradict themselves, and now you have something to look into. But this brings me to what I was saying in the episode, and I told you guys to remember it. These were two male individuals, according to this witness, that were seen committing this crime. They ran to a black car, and I will say that Stephanie and her husband owned a black car. Now, obviously a black car, super common. I have a black car. Does that mean I did it? Of course not. It's probably one of the most popular color cars out there. So I don't really think that's something we can harp on too much. But nevertheless, when we're thinking about what happened, we're talking about two male subjects. And as far as we know in this equation, we only have one male and two females. So there's someone else out there. There's someone else out there who's involved, maybe directly or indirectly, maybe they were just hired, but there's an individual that's part of this crime who has yet to be identified, even as I'm throwing out names to you, and that's important. So we got to bring everyone in and see if another person pops up that wasn't initially looked into. And if that does come up and that does become part of this investigation, now detectives can pull on that thread and see what it leads to. But you're only going to get that information by being active, by going out there and being aggressive and proactive in your approach to finding out what happened to Eric, because more than likely, the answers are not going to come to your doorstep if you're the detective in this case. No one's going to leave a little gift basket at your home saying, hey, 20 years later, congratulations, here you go. You got to go out there and find it. To wrap up my perspective, I do believe this was a murder for hire. There's someone out there who has an axe to grind with Eric and felt that he was a liability and he needed to be taken out. Who that person is or who those people are, I don't know. Maybe we've already identified them, or maybe they're yet to be discovered. That's the real question here. Who would want Eric Nelams dead? We have to start from the beginning. We have to break this case open and see if we missed anything the first time. And if we did, we need to act on it. But this all doesn't have to fall at the feet of law enforcement. We don't have to sit back and just be reactive. I do agree with Annie. People out there know what happened to Eric. And when more than one person knows, it's no longer a secret. So I'm hoping that someone listening or watching this episode has information that, based on what we said tonight, they realize is important. Or maybe it's someone who's on the outskirts, who wasn't directly connected, but had heard through the grapevine what had happened and just didn't feel right coming forward at the time, but now they feel obligated to do so. It's never too late. You can still do that. So for anybody out there who's thinking that could be them, I want to recap this episode for you. Eric Nelams was shot and killed outside his home in Phenix City, Alabama at around 5:30 a.m. on September 26, 2003. He was ambushed in his carport just as he was leaving for work, and detectives interviewed a witness who reported seeing more than one suspect. But more than 20 years later, no arrests have ever been made. If you have information about Eric's case, you can contact Alabama Crime Stoppers at 334-215-STOP, or you can use their online form. A $15,000 reward is being offered for an arrest and conviction. And as always, my final words go out to Eric's friends and family, specifically Annie, Kathy, Vincent, and Takia, who were gracious enough to help us with this case and allowing me the opportunity to share Eric's story. I hope I did it justice. I hope you interact with our listeners and viewers if you're in the comments, because I can tell you from experience, they're here to help you. I know sometimes you can feel alone, like you're in this fight by yourself, but I promise you that is not the case. You have an army behind you. We're all rooting for you, and we will do anything we can to get you the justice you deserve. And I hope I get the opportunity to share with everyone here that we have found the people responsible for Eric's death, and they are now in custody, and they're going to be held accountable for what they did. And as you guys have already said, they spend the rest of their life in prison thinking about what they did. Until that day comes, everyone stay safe out there, and I'll see you soon.